Today, we have a very fun episode planned out for you, and that is a subject that many of you are going to love if you love the late Bronze Age, the collapse, and piracy. The title of this episode being Piracy in the Bronze Age Collapse. We are joined by two very special guests, and that is none other than Dr. Aaron Mayer and Dr. Louise Hitchcock. And so I'd like to begin by talking about primary sources. But before we jump into that, based on your experience, Dr. Mayer, and your imagination, and based on the years of research you've given studies or subjects like this, when you hear the term piracy in the late Bronze Age, what do you imagine?
Well, I think in just about any historical period that we have relatively good documentation, and even to a certain extent when we go back into the Bronze Age, there seems to be evidence of groups who were, pirates, raiders who plied the seas, in various ways, whether from a ship base or from a coast that was hard to access. And they plundered shipping and other things, and when you have rich shipping on the one hand, that's something that attracts piracy, and of course, in periods in which the central powers are less powerful, and they don't have the ability to stop piracy, so piracy also flourishes. So the late Bronze Age is a good example of a period when there's a lot of international shipping in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we know this from many sources. And at the same time, at the end of the late Bronze Age and the beginning of the early Iron Age, that's a period when there's a process of collapse and change and transformation. Many of the so-called superpowers of that period go through either collapse or substantial changes, and that opens up the possibility of piracy. Now, you don't have to expect that everybody was with a wooden leg and an eye patch and said "ah" and like that, but people throughout history in many areas throughout the world, and then we're talking in times when there's excellent documentation, piracy was a common thing. So there's no reason to expect that it didn't exist in antiquity as well.
Well, that's a good question, because that's what got me interested in researching that topic, because I would often read articles about the sea people or book chapters or accounts or something, and it would say they were pirates or they committed acts of piracy. And it was never explained what that meant. So to me, it was a meaningless term. And that's what inspired me actually to start researching the topic, because it made me wonder, what did it mean to be a pirate in the 12th century BCE? And what I tried to do was to look at what was common to pirates across time zones and time periods. One thing I learned is that pirates typically do not write their own histories, somebody else does. So the histories tend to be very unflattering. In this way, it's kind of like the Philistines, in that the historical accounts of the Philistines come from the Old Testament. And so they're not about giving a factual account. They are usually negative portrayals. And so reading these histories and these accounts, though, gave me some indication of what was common to pirates in the Greek period, the Roman period, North Atlantic period. And then I also looked at seafaring in the Bronze Age, because, of course, the ship technology was different, the weaponry was different.
And when it comes to the subject of piracy in the late Bronze Age and in the collapse, do we have any primary sources on this particular subject? And if so, who were they and what can they tell us?
Well, there's not a lot of sources, but there's some Hittite sources which mention it. There's, for example, some of the depictions of the so-called sea peoples, for example, from Ugarit, seem to hint to sort of like a raiding type of image. Now, whether this is like a regular military raid or it's a piracy-like raid, it's perhaps hard to tell. And then there's a couple of sites which have been suggested to be related to piracy. For example, on Cyprus, there's a couple of sites where where promontories were overlooking shipping lanes, which have been suggested as perhaps somewhere where pirates were located. There's a site on the northern coast of Egypt, Marsa Matruh, which Bates Island, which was suggested as perhaps related to piracy. And for example, if you go on forward towards the Roman period, there were whole sections of the coast of modern day Turkey, which were known to be pirate areas, and the Romans fought these people. So there's no reason to assume that this was not the case back in those times as well. And again, if ships laden with goods and riches are coming by, and very often in antiquity, ships were sailed quite close to the coast. I mean, not in danger of being pushed in, but nevertheless keeping the coast, the highest mountains on the coast as close as possible to make navigation simpler. So it's no big deal to push off a boat from the coast and attack them. Just like the Somali pirates of today. They're utilizing the simplest ships. Nowadays they got more sophisticated, but in the beginning, all you needed is a shipping boat and a Kalashnikov, and you could take over a super tanker. And particularly in times when there's economic troubles and political issues, so I think this only exacerbated. And I think we don't have a lot of sources on it, but the Sea Peoples, what we call the Sea Peoples, among them the Philistines, I wouldn't say that all of them are pirates, but due to the fact that the Sea Peoples and the Philistines are appearing during a time of collapse, an extended time of collapse, Louise and I have argued again and again and again that we have to take into account that at least some of these peoples and groups had piracy in them, whether some of them were pirates or that was part of their activities, etc. But that's something to take into account when understanding this period and this phenomenon.
Gosh, it's really fragmentary. We have the Egyptian sources that talk about the people, the Sea People. They call them the people of the sea, or the people of the Great Green, or the people from the islands. The term Sea People is actually a modern term used collectively to refer to these 7 or so different tribes of Sea People, like the Shardanu, the Peliset or Philistines, the Luca or the Lycians. And the Egyptian sources talk about how they were engaged. And one of my favorite quotes is, and I'm not remembering it precisely here because I'm doing it from memory, but it was like, confident in their hearts, they felt, we shall not fail. And then it talks about how they were, just completely destroyed. And what we learned from this Egyptian source, the Egyptian sources, is that the Sea Peoples, if engaged in direct combat, they could be easily defeated, and that their success lay in sort of hit and run commando tactics. And for Crete, the people move from the coastline. A lot of them moved to the mountains to more easily defendable sites. And what I kind of learned about this, but also from reading about the Barbary pirates, is that the Barbary pirates desolated the coastlines of North Africa. And pirates overall tend to use these hit and run tactics, first of all, because it means you could have a small crew, but pirate ships often had larger crews, but you could have a small crew. You didn't have to worry so much about casualties. And even in the 18th century, medicine wasn't great. So you'd have less problem with casualties, and you could easily overtake a village by surprise and burn it and carry off what you needed, and also take slaves. Seems to be a pattern in historical piracy that whenever you have piracy, you also have slavery or slave trade, because that just becomes one more commodity the pirates can use. And sometimes instead of becoming slaves, these people they join the pirate culture. And usually you do that through what we would call in anthropology rites of initiation. So you become a pirate by showing your loyalty by engaging in acts of piracy. We have 14th century mentions of the Luca and the Ahyawa by the Hittites, and that they were sort of plundering. And also we have the famous letters that are mentioned in Search of the Trojan War, the famous Hittite letters that talk about Pia Merodus and always sort of attacking the Hittite world. And Pia Merodus wasn't so much a pirate, but a mercenary. And this gets into an idea of what I read this article by scholar Thomas Gallant, who works on modern Greek history. And by modern, I mean within the last several hundred years. And that he refers to what he calls military entrepreneurship. And this means there's like a continuum. If you make your money as a fighter or an independent mercenary, you might be a mercenary, you might be a robber, you might be a pirate, but you would be able to sort of act along this continuum. And then other sources we have that are more like, you have to try to read into them. You have what seems to indicate a shortage of metals at Pylos in the Mycenaean kingdom, in that there's a tablet saying that there was no allocation for the metalsmiths, which indicates that that trade was being disrupted, maybe. And then you also have references to watchers guarding the coast, which means they were on the lookout for anyone that could cause trouble. And you have references to muster 600 rowers. And so they might be engaged, not just using these rowers for maritime trade, but also to keep and maintain a presence to keep the sea lanes clear. And then there's like a very cryptic letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, where he says that they are at my shore, they are doing great damage. And so that would be a source. And we can also think in terms of archaeological sources, in the sense that you have all these destructions around the Mediterranean.
One subscriber had asked if the Iliad is essentially just about the Greek golden age of piracy. He goes on to say that in the story, he says, Achilles boasts, 12 cities of men have I laid waste with my ships, and even by land I avow throughout the fertile land of Troy. From out all of these I took much spoil and goodly, and all would I have ever bring to Agamemnon. He wants to know, is the Iliad really just showing us an example of piracy in the late Bronze Age? And I'd also like to bring up the Odyssey as well and ask if that could also tell us anything about piracy in the late Bronze Age.
Well, first of all, as I assume you probably have talked about this in the past, the Homeric texts are a very complex, multi-layered phenomenon. And there are apparent memories of the Aegean Bronze Age in it. And, there's various discussions. How can we define what is a memory from the late Bronze Age in the Homeric text? And although most scholars would say nowadays that the most significant part of the Homeric text actually reflects much later Iron Age, 8th century, 6th century, later on, way past the Bronze Age Aegean. Nevertheless, it does seem to reflect also aspects relating to the collapse of the Aegean Bronze Age and the collapse of the palace societies that existed in Greece at that time. And both during the collapse and probably beforehand as well, and afterwards as well, there were phenomena of related to piracy. So that might be reflected in these various things here. But again, you have to take into account that the Homeric text cannot be read as a blow-by-blow depiction of a specific historical event, but more of, it gives you the flavor of the times. And it gives us all kinds of different flavors of the time. And for example, a depiction of piracy might reflect both later Iron Age materials and the transitional period, and even beforehand, all enmeshed together.
Well, that's a good and a difficult question, because we know that Homer worked in the 8th century BCE, not in the 12th. What he might be relying on is historical memory, tales that we get from the Hittite kingdom. It's interesting. I don't remember if Aaron mentioned this, but the Old Testament term for the Philistine kings is Seren. And out of that, you get the Greek word tyrannos. And this is not a linear B word. We don't see this in linear B, but there is a Luvian word called Tarwanis. And it could be that the word for a pirate captain, it means warlord. The word for a pirate captain could be Anatolian. And what Homer might be talking about are sort of handed down tales. I'm always troubled by the Iliad as a source that's taken historically, because it always seems that the people get in there and they mix things up, and just when things get interesting, the gods step in and sort of solve it all. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was historical memory, and certainly there would have been plundering going on, probably even in Homer's time. So that's how I tend to see things like that. I know the Odyssey is seen as a lot closer to being an account of pirate activity, but certainly we might think of the Mycenaeans as going out and plundering, but you don't want to plunder everything. It's kind of like with too much automation. Henry Ford made the comment, if everything's automated, who's going to buy the cars?
I'd like to start by asking, has archaeology told us anything about piracy in the late Bronze Age?
Well, there's nothing, I would say, very, very explicit about it. There's, as I said before, there's hints from a couple of texts, and there's a couple of sites that have been suggested to be connected to piracy. But there's nothing, it's not as if, they found a pirate, a settlement like they have in the Caribbean or something like that. It's not as definitive of that. I think it's more what the various people who are talking about piracy in these periods are more, I would say, more saying is that based on the fact that in periods when we do have extensive historical documentation about piracy, it's very logical to reflect it back to these periods as well. And so that's I think the main thing. Unfortunately, we don't have the grave of someone with a wooden leg or an eye patch or something of the sort.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I sent these questions to Dr. Hitchcock, she's like, I love these. This is going to be a long episode. I like it. She said a lot of these questions are going to be answered with, we don't know. And I was like, I'm fine with that. I was like,
well, listen, I think there is an issue here of it's, you can't prove it. But again, very often we have to use analogies from different cultures and periods to try to understand, the picture, the periods in which things are a little less clear, the dark ages, let's call them. Often you do something that sounds logical, but you can't go very much farther than that based on the current finds and inscriptional material.
And so now we're going to talk a particular favorite subject, and that is art. In your opinion, does art tell us anything about piracy in the late Bronze Age?
Oh gosh, it tells us so much, just in that we don't have any accounts of the Sea Peoples tribes by them, and also with seafaring, we only have several shipwrecks, none of them necessarily pirate wrecks, and so most of what we know about ships comes from iconography and how it's either similar or changes. and what the Medinet Habu reliefs show, as well as these sort of really badly painted Mycenaean 3C pots, is that the preferred ship seems to be the Mycenaean galley, which is, of course, based on earlier Minoan ships. And it's sort of a longboat with a bird head device. And you see similar devices also on Sardinian bronze ship models. And then there's a stirrup jar from the Cycladic island of Keros that shows what I always thought was a Mycenaean ship, but more recently it's been identified as a Sardinian ship. And then some of these pottery sherds actually show they're fragmentary, they're not complete, but they show fragments of people fighting on a ship. And so it indicates there's some kind of fighting platform on these galleys. And you see sort of spiky-headed people, which indicates the spiky-headed helmets or the feathered helmets you see in the Medinet Habu reliefs. You tend to see two kind of helmets: the horned helmet, like you see behind me on my little, and you see, well, actually the horned helmet is on my left, and the feathered helmet is on my right. And these are the two main kinds of helmets you see. And we don't really know for sure what they are made of, but you see similar horned helmets on the Sardinian warriors, except with the Sardinian warriors, they're coming out of the front instead of out of the side. And then with the feathered helmet, they've actually found at the site of Portes in Arcadia in Greece, one of these metal bands that would fit around the head, and it had remains of canvas in the middle for like sticking feathers or quills or whatever they used to make these helmets from. And that's the first time they've actually found what is regarded as a sea people's helmet. So that's a rather important find. What's interesting is that what you'd never see with depictions of the sea people, you never see the boar's tusk helmets associated with heroic Mycenaeans, which is also mentioned in the Iliad. And why does the Iliad know that? Is because it's a Bronze Age. It's because it's a Bronze Age text, or is it because they robbed tombs and they found actual boar's tusk helmets? There's also, I mean, this, I'm kind of digressing a little bit here, but there's also like Hittite turns of phrase in the Iliad. There have been comparisons made to various Mesopotamian myths. So it's something that's kind of stitched together. It's not really a uniform sort of story. But getting back to the art, we have the Medinet Habu release. We have these pottery representations. We have this helmet. There's a couple BC period burials. By 3C period, I mean the period during the collapse. We don't have a lot of burials from this era of what might be considered pirates, but there's one in the from, I believe it's from Rhodes, and it shows or it is of a man who's buried with a Nautu sword, the famous Nautu sword we talked about in an earlier pod, and also a spear, an Italian style spearhead, an Italian style razor, and amber jewelry, and lots of other accoutrements with him. But we don't find much in the way of rich warrior burials from this period. So it's really kind of an important find. And then, of course, we have the weapons. I'm not sure, if you consider the weapons to be art or material culture, but it's still a piece of evidence. We don't have a lot of them. I think there are 17 Nautu swords found altogether in Greece. And I mean, the thing is, though, you wouldn't expect to have a lot because bronze often tends to be recycled and put to some other use. So 17 could be considered quite a lot. And then there's one of these hilltop defensible sites in Crete. They've actually found both a Nautu sword and an Italian razor in a house, which is an interesting context because it might indicate a house where one of these mercenaries or pirates was in fact living.
So based on other periods in history, such as, for example, we know that when it was not farming season, certain groups in medieval Europe, such as the Northmen, would actually go Viking, basically, their version of piracy. Based on the history of piracy, Would you say that in the Bronze Age it would have been seasonal?
It might have been, particularly people along the coast, because in traditional agriculture in the Mediterranean, you don't have what to do in your field, 12 months a year, and there are dead periods or less active periods. So if you're living along the coast or not far from it, it might be very logical to go out and to do it. Some of the empires utilize farmers in the off seasons to go on military campaigns. That's one possibility. Or, for example, farmers, would bring home the olive crop during one season and make olive oil, and then in the off season they would weave. So some people weave, and some people and make carpets, and some people go out and rob ships. So it's you got to keep your food on the table. Now another thing is, and I would assume this would be particular so in times of collapse and droughts and things like that. When there isn't enough food from agriculture, people have to look for alternative income. This is, by the way, what's happened, and is still happening to a certain in Somalia. People who are living in a failed state have to feed their families. I'm not saying it justifies them going out and being pirates, but that's the incentive. That's the reason why they're going out, because you look out at sea, and a couple of kilometers off the coast, there's ships carrying all the riches in the world, sailing by. So you can take out your ship and steal it, and then you can put food on your table. So I think that probably is, again, something that we had in many, many periods throughout history, even those when we don't have direct and clear-cut documentation of it.
Yes, absolutely. Because in the Bronze Age, the technology. Oh, there's one other thing I want to mention about the ships. What you see on the Medinet Habu reliefs, and a scholar named Jeffrey Emanuel has written a lot about this, is that you have a brailed sail, which you don't see on earlier Mycenaean galleys. And it's thought that this innovation was added from Canaanites. And it kind of points to sort of entangled culture that you would get amongst the sea people, especially with the different tribal names. And although we can't locate all of them, we certainly know the Luca were from Lycia. The Ahiawan were probably Greek, and possibly also Greeks living in the Anatolian coastline, and the Peliset, who we associate with the Philistines. And then there are others that are a bit more and we know that the Shekelesh, who are often associated with Sicily, occupied Tel Dor because of the Tale of Wenamun. So you have sort of changes in the ship iconography give us changes in the technology. These ships were not capable of sailing all year round in rough seas, and you had what was known as a sailing season, which went from April to October, with both April and October being the sort of iffy months where things could get rough and you could get stranded someplace. And in fact, Bernard Knapp, who's written on the Amarna texts and talks a bit about seafaring also, has written about how you have actual temporal distance, but you also have cultural distance. And he mentions how a seafarer who got stranded in Egypt ended up staying there for 6 years. And so even though the distances could be short, people might spend more or less amounts of time in certain places. But it was April to October. And again, this tells us where not all historical references are accurate. For example, we know the Cilician pirates sailed all year round because they're referred to as having lived on their ships. It seems that the Vikings, though, adhered to a sailing season. I'm not a huge expert on the Vikings. It's something I've just read a little bit about. An area I need to do a lot more reading on, where there's a lot of information, is Chinese piracy. But the Vikings also tended to have the sort of sowing season and the sailing season. So they would actually farm part of the year and go raiding the other part of the year. So there definitely was. And we have to sort of make some assumptions or try to figure out, well, when the pirates were taking off part of the year, where were they hanging out? And it's been suggested by Krzysztof Nowitzki that there's a fortified site in the Gorge of the Dead in eastern Crete near the Palace of Catasacro, where you might have had a pirate enclave because it would have made a suitable place for hiding out. Also, Aaron and I have suggested that Ma Paleocastro, which is a promontory on Cyprus, would have been a good place to hide out. Also, possibly Pila Kokinokremos on Cyprus. So they would have probably spent part of their year maybe just reverting to a farmer type lifestyle, and another part of their year raiding. Although it seems like piracy at the end of the Bronze Age, whereas it was sort of a ongoing but sporadic activity earlier on, at the end of the Bronze Age, where it becomes intense, that you would have had probably just a couple generations of pirate activity. And then they seem to, once the Hittites lose their grip on coastal Anatolia and the Egyptians lose their grip on Canaan, and some of the centers in Cyprus are disrupted, you seem to have where they resettle quite quickly.
And so I would assume realistically we probably don't, but I could be wrong. And that is, do we know anything about the sizes of different pirate groups? What could we expect to be average or abnormally large?
Well, I would assume that if you had small piracy, like people living on a coast and going out on a small boat or ship, then you're talking about a small group of 5, 10, 15, 20 people, no more than that. Though if you understand some of the sea people phenomena as related to piracy, so perhaps there you had larger groups working maybe, with several ships simultaneously, to do what they're doing. Now, again, this is very well paralleled with many, many historical examples of piracy of just a bunch of farmers in a boat with some weapons, down to pirate fleets. And there's, for example, depictions of the Roman Navy fighting large fleets of pirates, that which were a major problem that they had to deal with in major naval combat.
Okay, I actually talk about this, or we actually talk about it in our World Archaeology article. And what we relied on for demographics was partly Asaf Yasser-Lando's book, where he argues that the Philistines were Mycenaean colonists. But he does some anthropological and demographic studies and suggests that the numbers were not all that huge, around 3,000 to 4,000, I think. And we also know that in the 18th century, the numbers were not so great, about 3,500, but they don't start out that big. And this is a good thing that Marcus Rediker talks about. The North Atlantic piracy, you have just 2 original ships, and which were crewed by, I don't know how many people, but from these 2 original ships, you end up expanding to 3,500 or so pirates. And what happens is that as they capture prizes and attain followers, the followers have to go into another ship because you can only carry so many people. And then as I kind of liken it to hunter-gatherer tribes, because I'm not saying that pirates are hunter-gatherers, but what happens is with hunter-gatherer tribes is that they tend to have a catchment zone that they forage in. And when the group gets too big, or if there's fighting and disagreement, they fission off and the group goes to occupy another area. And I think we can look at the pirates like in this way, in this regard, in that when more and more ships get captured and you have it gets too crowded within a certain geographic area, they split off and let's say exploit another niche. Except for them, exploiting a niche isn't growing and hunting food or producing anything. It's plundering. And that's kind of interesting. Again, the Cilician pirates seem to be more of an anomaly. It's suggested, or it's recorded that there were up to 10,000 of them. And in fact, it's been argued that there were so many Cilician pirates, they couldn't have all come from Cilicia. So they had to have also acquired quite a number of followers. But they seem to be the sort of the exception to the rule, in that they sailed all year round and their numbers were so great. It was more attractive. Piracy was more attractive to members of the British Royal Navy in the North Atlantic era, because the way the British Navy would sort of kit out their ships would be to have the minimum number of people on the ship to make the ship run smoothly, and then accounting for death and accident, things like that. And the differences with the pirates is that they would have the maximum number on the ship that they could have, because their economy was to sort of share everything, to share it equally. It was very much an egalitarian society in that regard. And maybe the person who got a little bit more on a pirate ship, and then this is in historical times, would be the doctor or the captain, who could attain leadership through skill and prowess. But again, they did not really portray themselves as having so much more than anyone else on the ship. And they could also have as much grog as they wanted, instead of grog being rationed out, again, as in the British Royal Navy. So even though you might have a short life as a pirate, I mean, usually if you made it to 30, you were an elderly pirate. And on these ships, and again, this is very well portrayed in Master and Commander, where you have the young boy who's on the ship. People would be pressed into the British Royal Navy in childhood. And there's no reason not to think that this also happened in the time of the Sea Peoples. And there is no indication of hierarchy from what we know in the iconography of Sea People ships, where they're shown as prisoners on the Egyptian relief. There's nothing that really picks out one of the particular Sea People as special or different, except one that is I think they have their hands manacled behind their back, and that might be the only difference, and that might indicate the captain. But there's nothing to indicate any sort of hierarchical structure. And from everything we know of historical piracy, it seems to be an egalitarian structure where everything is shared. And this is interesting in terms of what we know about feasting. Feasting in the 13th century world of the Mycenaeans was something provisioned by the palaces. And you would have what they call a diacritical feast. And what that means is space is segmented, whereby you have the sort of people, the farmers and so forth, outside the palace, and you had the more elite people in the more inner areas. And the more inside you were, the more elite you were. It's kind of like today when you go to a rock concert. Are you standing in the crowd, or do you have the backstage pass? And that sort of connotes your difference within the hierarchy. Now, when we get to Homer, the Homeric term for feasting is deus, and deus means to share. So it means that things were shared, as opposed to you having this hierarchy of feasting. And the two main activities that do take place in Homer are feasting and fighting. And this would also seem to sort of go along with the idea of piracy. And so it would, like, you might have a ship that's overcrowded. At the same time, if they wanted to take a city, the ships could actually beach with a minimal crew, so they could carry off more stuff. And apparently the Mycenaean galley was a ship that was fairly easy to operate. So you could have a minimal crew and maybe have your other crew waiting elsewhere, or maybe just operate with a minimal crew. And while the Mycenaean galley would be the ship of preference, again, what we know from historical piracy is that pirates would, it would be like a crime of opportunity. If you took a ship and it wasn't quite perfect, you'd use it anyway. And we do know that in ancient times before, like you had the isthmus, or you had at the Isthmus of Corinth before the canal was cut through. With smaller ships, you could actually drag them over land or put them in a cart and move them that way. So you might have a variety of ships, but again, there were always preferred types of ships.
So when it comes to weapons and armor in the late Bronze Age, and then the subject of piracy, most of us who have studied the Sea Peoples are familiar with the reliefs that show them fighting the Egyptians. And in some cases, we know they've got horned helmets, so on and so forth. When it comes to typical piracy and ruling out possible large naval battles that may not have been related to piracy, such as these battles of the Nile and stuff like that, would we have been expecting realistically more farm tools to be used in these acts rather than actual military weapons?
Who knows? I mean, listen, in the end of the day, ancient military naval warfare is basically the same as land warfare, except you're doing it on a platform at sea, because you didn't have long range weaponry as they had, cannons, etc. So almost all naval warfare is basically bringing your ships together and then either from very close range shooting arrows one another or boarding. And that was the major component in ancient naval warfare, is to maneuver your vessel so you can ram the other and then board. You can use a sword, but if you don't have a sword and you have an agricultural implement that you can hit someone on the head, that might work as well. But I would assume that the pirates, if they were more organized and they had weapons of different types, and it could very well be, and this is something that Louise and I have suggested, that the pirate groups were multi-ethnic, multicultural groups of various origins, and again, one of the reasons why we say this is because, again, when you look at pirate groups in better documented periods, they're very often comprised of a very mixed bag of people of different origins. And it could very well be that each one brings the sword or the dagger or the bow and arrow typical of his culture, and then they fight in this mixed bag of equipment.
Well, I don't know what you would call military grade in the Bronze Age, but what we tend to see in depictions of the Sea People, and it's very similar again to what you see in these Sardinian bronze figurines, and you also see it in the ingot god at Enkemi, which is kitted out like a Sardinian warrior, except for his ingot that he stands on. Although recent studies have shown that the ingot and the beard on the ingot god were later additions. And they tend to be kitted out with a spear and a shield and a helmet. And then it seems like they wear a corselet, and the corselet was probably made of leather. It could even, and we know from both from Aegean art as well as from Homer, we have these descriptions of oxhide shields. And that's where you actually make the shield out of animal hide on a wooden core. And I was in the Maritime Museum in Sydney a few years ago, where I saw some Aboriginal armor, and the armor was actually, it wasn't armor, but it was like a body shield you wore, and it was horsehide. And instead of just one layer of horsehide, there were multiple layers of it to create a cushion to protect one. I would think something like metal armor would be very rare. We only have two kinds of evidence, as far as I know, for metal armor, and that would be, you find these sort of plates for making plate armor, small plates like about that big, that would be stitched to something. We never find huge numbers of them. We find isolated pieces, and they're often in a ritual context. And so if people collected them and made a few, sewed them to something, and just had a few or had a lot, I don't know. And then we have the famous Dendrah armor from the Mycenaean world, which is quite a bit earlier. I think it dates to like the 15th or 16th century. But the armor is made out of concentric rings of bronze, and each ring is tied to the previous ring with horsehide, and it weighs about 30 kilos, and all the weight hangs from your shoulders, and it's very painful to wear. You would have to be wearing some kind of leather padding underneath. And then if you fall down, you're literally like a turtle on its back. You cannot get up. And because it's kind of a one-off, a lot of people believe it was probably more like ceremonial armor that the king would wear, like going in a chariot procession, do like the queen wave as he's going along. But it wouldn't have, or, it makes you think also of something like jousting, where you're just in a stationary thing and you're trying to knock somebody else out of their chariot. But it doesn't seem to me to be of much practical value. What it seems to see, if you had metal, maybe a breastplate, but it seems like mainly what you have are sort of leather armor, and maybe hide armor and wood. And then the shields you get depicted in earlier Aegean art, these big figure of 8 shields. And what you tend to see more is like a hoplite style armor, almost with the sea people, with a smaller round shield, and then the spear and the sword. And you also see this depicted on the famous warrior vase from Mycenae, which also dates from the era of the Sea People. And usually you only see the side, because it's better preserved, where they're wearing the horned helmets. On the other side of the warrior vase, there are actually people wearing these sort of feathered or porcupine style helmets. So it really is kind of a vase depicting Greeks as sea people's types.
So we know that piracy in the late Bronze Age could probably be very sporadic. And so I want to talk about control over the shipping lanes. When it comes to the late Bronze Age, which governments or national entities can we expect to be patrolling with their navies, basically?
Well, you have the Egyptians and the Hittites. Probably also some of the Aegean polities had navies, and I would assume that in times when these kingdoms, empires were strong and they projected their power, then they would be more effective in stopping piracy, whether actually physically being there and stopping them, or knowing that, oh, I don't want to mess with these people, so I'm not gonna steal from the ships that are connected to them. But I would assume that even in times of when the Egyptian empire was strong, there still were people out there who were trying to rob the roads and rob the seaways.
And now, do we know anything about pirate bases and possible locations for hideouts, forts, and ports?
Probably river valleys, strategic areas like promontories, areas near choke points. A choke point would be an area where the geography would force a group of ships to sort of spread out. For example, Troy being on the Straits of the Dardanelles is a perfect example of a choke point. And it's probably why Troy was a wealthy city, because it would have controlled transportation from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. And it could be why it was let's say, a desirable target for Aegean and other warriors to try to capture. So places like that, any place that occupied a strategic area. And it's interesting. We did a paper a few years ago where I started looking at Crete just in terms of its of strategic placement. And in the earlier era of the Minoans, it's known as a period of peace, and that there was a Minoan thalassocracy, although the Minoan thalassocracy is something mentioned in the 5th century by Thucydides. And some historians have argued that, and I know one of your listeners is going to get very upset with this, but that Thucydides developed this idea of a Minoan thalassocracy to legitimize the idea of an Athenian thalassocracy. Now, this is not my idea. This is an idea that has been floated by a number of historians. And when I was working on my PhD on the Minoan palaces, I'd always go to sites very blinkered, just focused on the architecture and the building and not really paying much attention to the landscape. And the last couple of trips I made to Crete, I went around thinking more about where these sites were situated. And a lot of them are either situated near the coast or on the coast or a little ways back from the coast, or even overlooking the coast, but also strategically placed near a river valley. For example, there's a very important palatial villa in southern Crete called Myrtos Pyrgos, and it's on a hill. It overlooks the Libyan Sea, but it also overlooks a river valley. And river valleys, from what we know about later studies of pirate geography, river valleys were favorite hideouts for pirates because they could hide there, but they could also undertake ambushes from there, just as they could from promontories. And it seems like what also sort of helped contribute to what we call the Pax Minoica or Minoan peace, most of their sites were not fortified, was the fact that they located their power centers in strategically placed areas. And that alone could have helped contribute to their security. Now we see this also with the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland. They're located again near the coastline, in bays, harbors, maybe a little ways back. For example, Mycenae was not so visible in the Argolid. However, Tiryns was. In Mycenaean times, the sea came practically right up to Tiryns. And this has been determined by core samples of the soil. And so they would have had a presence advertising themselves, advertising their presence. And that presence would be like a deterrence. Just like today we have deterrences. In the era of the Barbary pirates, as a deterrence, you'd have these fortified cities, and they'd have captured pirates that were dead in a gibbet hanging over the walls as sort of a means of deterrence. But getting back to the Mycenaeans for a moment, a lot of the sites that were areas that were occupied under the Mycenaeans later became occupied by the Venetians. So that indicates also their attractiveness as sort of trading centers, but also trading centers would also help to sort of create a sort of sense of presence.
One subscriber had asked, when it comes to piracy, were there certain trade routes that we can think were the most affected when it comes to piracy? And if so, did pirates and their presence influence the development or expansion of navies from national entities?
Well, for the early periods, that's really hard to say. I mean, what do we know about it? We know so little about it. I mean, we do know that in later periods that the Romans, and then later on, and the Western navies were very, there were periods when they were very, very occupied with fighting piracy, and at the same time, sometimes utilized pirates or what they called privateers for their uses. And listen, till today, it took quite a few years for Western modern navies to get a hold on the Somali pirates. They were running circles around, but the Western countries for quite a while. So I'm sure these were issues that were problems for many navies and many kingdoms and many polities over the centuries.
I'm actually glad you brought up basically a lot of entities throughout history using pirates as almost a contracting group to mess with people, right? Based on that, realistically, do you think that, let's say, ancient Egypt or the Hittites in Anatolia may have also had similar relations with pirate groups as well, paying them to basically attack, let's say, rival trade centers?
It could very well be, and we know that both the Hittites and the Egyptians used soldiers of various origins, whether they were people who were captured and then enlisted into the army, or they were mercenaries who came from afar. And for example, the Chardanu apparently served as mercenaries in various armies at the time. And we know that, for example, in later times, in the Iron Age, there were Greek mercenaries who hired themselves out to all kinds of kings and political entities in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I assume that existed in earlier times as well. And one of the ways to win a war is to be tricky. And if you can use your against your enemies all kinds of different groups that exist out there, so you're doing your job well. Because in warfare, until the Geneva Convention, it didn't matter how you did it as long as in the end you came home and you were victorious. So you could be very, very sneaky and underhand. Listen, until today, they say that the second oldest profession in the world is spying. So that's also part of it.
We now come to a question I think you're going to enjoy, and that is the question of disease and piracy in the late Bronze Age. And my question is, do we have any records at all or any evidence that suggests possibly pirates having any issues with disease that would have been around during the late Bronze Age?
We don't have any records of pirates and their diseases because we don't have any records of pirates written by pirates almost ever. And I'll come back to the disease in a moment, but I want to mention the language of the Barbary pirates. You've heard the term lingua franca, correct? Mm-hmm. We usually think of lingua franca as a language used that different cultures use to communicate internationally because it becomes like an international language. However, the original use of the term lingua franca was the name of the Barbary pirates language, which was an amalgamation of like Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Italian, and several other languages. And we have very few examples of it. And it's kind of a modern, only partially deciphered language. So we don't even have their histories written by them anyway. So we don't have any records specifically of pirates and their diseases. What we do have, we have plague deities that were, as I talked about in the other pod, worshipped throughout the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, indicating plague was around. We have historical evidence that the Hittite king and his son died of plague, which could have created enough weakness in their kingdom to make it easier to overthrow them. We have a mouse from the Ulu Barun, which could have been a plague carrier of disease. Ships, without a doubt, carry diseases. And we don't know what kind, if any, would have been carried then, but it's quite possible that certain ships of pirates had disease, but we really don't know what role it precisely would have played. I mean, we also know, as I mentioned before, we know that in the Amarna letters that there was a shipment of copper that was late getting from Cyprus to Egypt because they were gripped by the hand of Nergal, which means they had a plague. So there were probably plagues and illnesses going on, which probably created moments of weakness, might have been seen as a disease brought by different groups of people who traveled by ship. Pirates might have had it, but we don't have any really any hard evidence.
And so when it comes to the late Bronze Age, and not just in the collapse, but periods leading throughout the Bronze Age, we've come a long way in scholarship and archaeology and understanding trade and trade routes in the Bronze Age. And though we have a lot more to learn, I was hoping that you could tell us, when it comes to trade routes throughout the Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age, how affected do you think these trade routes were?
Back in the 1980s, when I was a student, I told my history professor that I wanted to do a paper on economy in the classical period. And he said there was no economy because there was no word for it. It was just oikos, which meant the household. And then you had this historian, Moses Finley, who sort of started, he sort of brought structuralism into classical history, arguing that you had structures even if you didn't have texts talking about them. And so you would have to have economy. And it's only then that you started to have economy talked about really broadly. And then you start to have Roman historians coin hoards and their significance. And it's really only in the 90s and later that you start to have talk about pre-monetary economy, which is the economy of the Bronze Age trade and so forth. And so it's been the last 30 years have been really exciting for trying to understand even Bronze Age economy, because it's become an area that's more legitimate to work in, an area that more people are interested in. And so it's really kind of a new way of looking at things instead of just looking at big buildings and big men. I think the coast of Crete was susceptible because it seems to have become somewhat desolated. You still have a few big centers that persist into the Iron Age, and it's probably because they're so big that they weren't attacked. Sites like Hanya in the northwest and Knossos in the north central area. But then you have all this other movement to mountaintops. And of course, the Mycenaean sites were susceptible because they were destroyed. And you have a kind of a depopulation in the mainland that we talked about in connection with pandemic. Any coastal areas are going to be great for having trade, but they're also going to be susceptible to piracy, especially with these attacks by night. You asked me earlier about garden tools being used as weapons. I'm sure they were. You have this one part on the Medinet Habu reliefs that show what looks like a garden hoe on a rope being used to pull down the mast on the Mycenaean ship. So was it a grappling hook or was it a garden hoe? I really don't know, but there's no reason you wouldn't. But something that you do see as a great change is we get into the era where the so-called sea people settle, and you have all these new sites or newly inhabited sites or newly amalgamated sites. It's like when people migrate, they don't migrate to places where they're strangers. They usually migrate to some place with a prior connection. And so instead of destroying like a lot of these Canaanite sites, it seems like the sea people settled among them and sort of formed what what Aaron and I call an entangled culture. But you don't see weapons. We have hardly any Philistine weapons. What we do have are tools. So there's a shift in terms of how metal is being used. But back to trade routes. The trade routes we would know from sort of the movement of imports. For example, Crete had very few raw materials. What they were able to export was in the earlier era of the palaces was textiles and probably wood. And we know the Mycenaeans had a perfumed oil industry at Pylos from the Linear B texts. And we know we know how pottery moved around from seeing Mycenaean pottery in the Levant or in Egypt. We know that gold had to be coming from Egypt. Ivory had to be coming from Egypt or Syria, but probably mostly from Egypt. So it's sort of the sort of movement of these items that partly helps us understand trade routes. You also get earlier in the Mycenaean period, you have Baltic amber in the Mycenaean shaft graves. This doesn't necessarily mean that Mycenaeans were traveling all the way to the Baltic region, but you would have what we call down the line trade, where things move from one place to another, just like the caravanserai routes. So you probably had direct trade, you probably had indirect trade, and especially tin and copper. I mean, these had to come from certain specific areas. And so we can use this sort of distribution of finds to help reconstruct trade routes. Now, having said that, there are a couple of really interesting things. Sardinia and Sicily, which are very close together, and the Western Med is a place I've just started looking at. And I have a Sardinian PhD student coming to work with me next year. And you should actually do something with her because she knows Sardinian archaeology really well, and she's going to be one of the few people that can really translate it to the Anglophone world. Anyway, you have a very different material culture on Sicily and Sardinia, despite the fact they're extremely close together. And it seems like trade routes that were going from Cyprus to Sardinia bypassed Sicily and went mainly straight to Sardinia, although you do have some Aegean objects in the region of Syracuse in Sicily. But Sicily otherwise seemed to be a very, very isolated in many ways, although you do have a Mycenaean style building from the 12th century that we're about to submit an article on right now. But still, not much contact. The contact seems to be more between Sardinia and Cyprus. And it seems kind of weird in some ways, because what were the Cypriots getting? Because Cyprus had copper and Sardinia had copper. I'm thinking maybe they were getting Cornwall tin from the Sardinians or exchanging technologies. But Sardinia also has a very unique material culture based on these round fortresses called Nuraghi. But I'm kind of digressing a bit. But what I'm trying to say is that the trade routes were not always as direct as we'd like to think, because you might have certain areas being bypassed for we don't know why. And you would also have currents that would make a difference. At the last Cretan Historical Studies Conference 5 years ago, I went to a talk on the movements of one of the disciples of Christ, and how he moved around and how he got from Ashkelon to Corinth. And he had to take a very specific route that had him traveling along the northern coast of Crete and then up towards Corinth, rather than along the southern coast or other areas. And this has to do with currents, and also maybe where there were safe harbors. But there are subtle things that we don't entirely know. There was this idea back in the time of shortly after the discovery of the Uluburun, that the Uluburun followed this continuous circular route around the Mediterranean, going from place to place to place, and just continuously offloading and uploading goods. And that was kind of the trade route that most people embraced for a long time. And then this other scholar, Carol Bell, who looked at trade between Cyprus and the Levant, she wrote an interesting paper called Wheels Within Wheels. And what she meant by that is, like, you might have this big circular trade route, but you might also have smaller trade routes, like going from Encami to Byblos and back and forth. So you could have, you would have a whole wide variety of different trade routes, is what I'm saying. And it's hard to always like single them out discreetly. But we did try. We did try in our papers that are our published papers, Aaron and I, to sort of show some of the possible different trade routes that people were using, or that pirates were using.
And so now I want to talk climate and nature. Many of my subscribers had asked if climate change could have had any effects on piracy during the late Bronze Age, and especially in encouraging it.
I'm sure if we see piracy as one of the factors behind it is societal collapse and a lack of resources and lack of governmental control. So we know, for example, that towards the end of the late Bronze Age, there was a period of drought, and that may have been one of the major engines behind the late Bronze, Iron Age transformation and collapse. So I would assume this is so also for things like piracy. When you don't have enough food, when there's not enough control, and all this can be related to issues of climate, then you're out there.
Realistically, when we look at the history of piracy, and especially as we approach the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, especially in the 18th century, you start to see government-sponsored piracy. Privateers who work for the government, usually to troll the enemy, so on and so forth. Do you think realistically state-sponsored piracy would have existed in the Bronze Age?
I have a hard time accepting that, because they could just deal with ad hoc piracy, like if they needed slaves or something. And I think to encourage too much piracy would hurt production and would hurt trade. Oh, there's an interesting book that's written about later piracy on pirate economics. And the author argues, even though he's a free market economist, he argues that piracy actually helped distribute capital, more widely dispersed capital, by moving it to places where it might not have ordinarily been, through taking from rich places and distributing it to other places. And this also brings in another important aspect of pirate economics. We often think of piracy like especially with the Johnny Depp movies, or the movies from the Errol Flynn movies about pirates always being after this chest full of treasure. What pirates really wanted was food and grog. And if they did plunder objects, it was more for the purpose of exchanging it. But the main things they were after, like food, grog, and slaves, things they could really make a lot of use of. But I just have a hard time seeing a lot of evidence for state-sponsored piracy, unless, again, you think of things like the stories of Pia Merodus from ancient Miletus or Miliwanda, who was striking out at the Hittites and causing them lots and lots of trouble. So you might have had a limited amount of it. It's hard to identify. And it's like, the one thing we like about the pirate model is it accounts not just for the fact that you have Mycenaean style pottery being produced all over the Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age, but it also accounts for other anomalies, things like Cypriot types of ritual activity, from notched cattle scapulae, which are used for fortune telling, which you find not just in Cyprus by then, but also in the Philistine world at Tel Asafi, and you find it as far away as Sicily. Or things like the name Tarwanus, which is Luvian, or the so-called Walates inscription from Tel Asafi, which is a Lydian name, and the brailed sail, which comes from the Canaanite culture. And all these things point to pirates being a more multicultural sort of culture that sort of melded aboard ship into something independent from its origins. I don't want to push the model any farther than I can go based on sort of sound arguments that are based on evidence and based on historical texts. We might come up with something better in the future, but it's or somebody else might come up with something, but I just don't see it right now.
And so now, as we come to the end of this, I want to bring up the Sea Peoples and ask how they fit into piracy in the late Bronze Age and collapse. And the reason why I specify that is I don't necessarily consider all the Sea Peoples to be pirates, right? I feel like there's a lot more to that, especially when you have large groups of them supposedly moving by land and fighting alongside people moving by sea. And so there's definitely more of a strategic military element there. And I don't want to confuse migrations and military style invasions with piracy. And so my question is, would you consider it accurate to consider certain elements to be pirates, but not all of them?
My view on the Philistines, for example, is that it's a group that's consisted of many peoples of various origin backgrounds. So, for example, I don't think that the Philistines, came in a uniform, organized migration, neither by sea or by land, but rather they were comprised of various peoples, some of which came by land, some of which came by sea from outside the Levant, but also those within the Levant. Now, among the people coming from outside of the Levant, I think it's very logical to assume that some of them came from pirate-like backgrounds. When you see the evidence that we do have from the Philistines during the Iron Age, we don't have evidence of extensive piracy in Iron Age Philistia. But that doesn't mean that some of the groups that the Philistines were eventually comprised of were not of pirate-like backgrounds and pirate-like activities. And again, because all of this is occurring during the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition, and all the collapse that's going on there for more than a century, I think it's very logical to assume that there are also piratical elements out there, and they, or at least some of them, eventually become part of the Philistines.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I was curious to know if it would have been. I know I've seen it online. Several people will say, and I had even wondered it at first, that basically all the sea peoples were pirates, and a part of me had kind of felt, I just don't necessarily feel that that's completely accurate.
I think it's making things too simplistic. You know, they're the sea peoples phenomenon and the late bronze Iron Age transition phenomena are complex, multifaceted processes which are going on for 100, 150, even 200 years with all kinds of vectors from all kinds of directions. Some of them may be related to piracy, but to say that they're all pirates is you're going back to square one for a simplistic explanation. I think we know enough nowadays to say that things are not, it's not a simple black and white explanation, but rather a complex, multicolored, mishmash,
No, I completely agree. When it comes to the sea peoples, the late Bronze Age, the collapse, and piracy, I've heard a lot of people automatically associate the sea peoples in general with piracy. Do you believe that it could be somewhat inaccurate to do so, as in obviously there are some pirate elements to the sea peoples, but that it could be a oversimplification to just call them all pirates?
I think it was an oversimplification before Aaron and I drew out the model to kind of explain how piracy as an activity could have worked. I mean, obviously these pirates were trying to eke out a living for themselves, but I think piracy does pretty well describe the sea peoples. And there weren't, as I said, there weren't huge hordes and numbers of them. There were some numbers of them. And I think piracy and, let's say, robbery best explains the evidence for their movements, their settling, their the sort of entangled nature of their material culture. I'm not wedded to this theory, even though I have 4 articles. If it pushes somebody to write a better explanation, I'm all for that. But I think it's a much better explanation than Mycenaean colonization, and a much more accurate means. It's like, why would Mycenaeans want to go colonize anywhere? So no, I think it's right now the best theory. But again, somebody comes up with a better one, go for it. I'm happy for them to put their theory out there and let it stand or fall. I do kind of have one other thing I'd like to mention.
Yeah, go for it.
You didn't mention gender, and there's not a huge amount of evidence for gender. We have pictures of the sea people traveling over land in carts where you see women and children. But we do have evidence in other eras that women were pirates. I don't know the details on this because I haven't looked at the Chinese evidence yet, but there was a very prominent female Chinese pirate. We do know of 2 female pirate captains from North Atlantic piracy in the 18th century. One was named Mary Bonney. I don't remember the name of the other one offhand, but these are mentioned in Marcus Rediker's book. But we do know that there were female pirate captains. And if they aren't depicted in depictions of the sea people, it might have to do with the fact that in later eras, female pirates dressed like men when they were engaging in piratical activities. They could have also been left at settlements, but it's very possible that women did engage in piratical activities. We also have Royal Navy burials from an island off the coast of Egypt from, again, the era of Royal Navy activities. And one was a woman who was buried like a man with weapons. And she also had a little sort of ball from one of these guns or muskets or whatever rolled into the curl of her hair, which was very much a way that male maritime pirates and warriors, it was a way they buried themselves. So this is a burial from a later period. There's also a Viking burial of a female Viking warrior. And not the word warrior burial is very problematic because you get it. A lot of times it's assumed when there are weapons, it's a man, or that when they're buried with weapons, it's a warrior. And now that we're starting to get more skeletal studies, they're realizing, first of all, that occasionally you do have female warriors buried with weapons. And also occasionally you have warrior burials where they weren't warriors. And being buried with a weapon doesn't necessarily determine that you're a warrior. What determines it is that usually there's a certain amount of muscle memory involved in being a warrior or a swords person. And it's usually something that started, the military training starts when you're a teenager. And so not everybody, even who participated in the Sea People's activity, was probably a warrior. Some of them were probably just rowers or very clumsy fighters. But usually if you're skilled as a swords person or as a fighter, you have a place in the shoulder where the connecting tissue is connected, and it's usually thickened on warriors. And so if you don't have that thickening in the muscle tissue, if you have the burial, then it would sort of indicate that person might have been buried like a warrior, but was maybe not a warrior, maybe a wannabe warrior. So that is something also very interesting. The problem with the Sea People is we don't have a lot in the way of Sea People burials. So we can't tell that, but I just wanted, and we can't prove that there were female pirates among the Sea People. I just kind of wanted to sort of put it in as a possibility to indicate that it's something we see in other eras, in other cultures, and it could have been a possibility.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, it's especially when you look at the Sea Peoples and other pirate groups, you have a very multicultural, oftentimes even multiracial groups. And so it wouldn't surprise me if obviously there would have been women fighting as a pirate in the Bronze Age. I mean, we know, for example, among barbarian tribes in Europe, to where in the Roman and Greek world, women participating in military combat was kind of a frowned upon thing. But in barbarian territory, it was normal. You know, a woman, for example, could lead armies in Celtic Europe, and stuff like that. And so it'd be interesting. I will ask this.
If your life is on the line, you're not going to stay at home weaving. You're just going to go out there and try to save yourself as well.
Do you think that for example, the depiction of the Sea Peoples by the Egyptians, do you think that even, let's say, there were women who were pirates who were visible, do you think the Egyptians would have left them out on purpose due to their view on Egyptian society?
Not really, because you had Egyptian kings that were women, and although they were portrayed as men, but I just think they would have been what you see with the Sea Peoples, other than the wagon scenes where you do have women portrayed. With the warriors, they're all in warrior garb, and so they might have just chose to stereotypically portray them as warriors. And again, if you look at the portrayals of the North Atlantic female pirates, they're dressed like men. There is one other thing I want to mention, and again, this will make some of your viewers' heads explode, and it's on the idea of ethnicity and ethnic identity. Pirates would have been an entangled culture then. They were entangled later, and by that, I mean you have different cultural groups intermingling. I like to use Barbarossa as the perfect example. He was born on Rhodes. His mother was Greek Christian. His father was Albanian Muslim. He wore Turkish garb, including a turban, but had like a little cross in his turban. And many of the Barbary pirate captains were actually British. They continued to practice Christianity, but they adopted Muslim names and Muslim garb. And so what constitutes identity is very much what we would say is entangled in these areas. And not just because we're trying to be politically correct or a social justice warrior, but because when you have maritime trade and islands and coastal emporia and people moving around, there is a lot of opportunity for cultural mixing to take place. And it just was kind of a fact of life. We tend to often try to take our modern categories and impose them on the past where they're not really necessarily operative. The categories are more, let's say, fluid.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today at the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a blast doing it. I really love these subjects, and I'm so grateful for these awesome two professionals and scholars for coming on the show to better educate me and you on the subjects that we love. Dr. Aaron Mayer, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Always great being here.
Dr. Louise Hitchcock, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure as always.